Welcome to another episode of A Come Together.
Paul and yeah, an oil rig.
Padraig. There we
Paul
go.
rig.
Padraig. Professor,
Yes.
welcome. So happy to have you here. Happy New
Thank you.
Year and happy 2026. Isn't it
Many happy
crazy?
returns. Yeah.
Any happy returns. Yeah, well, I got my pint of Guinness and I'm ready for a lot of fun and hopefully a very educational conversation
Hopefully.
about geography. So
Yeah.
so I got interested in this whole topic of, aside from geography, economic relationships,
Uh-huh.
between countries and using economics to kind of expand empires. I became
Hmm.
familiar with this notion when I was reading a book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman,
Yeah.
and I actually interviewed the author, who is really a wonderful man,
Yeah.
and then he told me after I interviewed him about his first book, he's like, I actually wrote two more books since, and one of
Yeah.
them is specifically about how China is so much better at this game today than America is at this point in time.
Mm.
And I started looking into where China was investing, and I noticed that a lot of it was in Africa and South America.
Uh-huh.
And so that kind of is what prompted me to reach out and to start doing some homework into geography and some of
Mm.
this history and some of the impact that it leads to today. So that's why
Uh-huh.
we're here today.
Great. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
So
So, yeah.
please tell me about whatever comes to mind.
So, I suppose we're living in a world now where we have two superpowers. Uh, for the first time in a long time since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. China, I think, by most measures, is a superpower now.
Hmm.
And that means that, it takes an interest in all world regions. So
Yeah.
Africa, Latin America are very important in terms of resources.
Mhm.
We can relate that to what's been happening in Venezuela as
I,
well
I would
in
love
the
to, by the
in
way.
in
I would
in
love to.
in the last few days. And you know, the scale of investment in Europe is quite substantial.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
In
the
America,
amount.
near the military bases and farmlands and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there's Chinese investment. The Americans have been more restrictive historically. So there was a
Mhm.
case where there was an oil company, Unocal, I think it was in 2005, and a Chinese company wanted to buy that out, and that was blocked on national security grounds. So even back 20 plus years ago, there was awareness and tension around those kinds of issues. The Europeans have played a more kind of straddling role, but total Chinese investment in Africa apparently is equivalent to Chinese investment in Germany. So even it's because African economies are generally so small that
Mhm.
China's footprint seems kind of oversized there, whereas it's not as noticeable in some of the bigger economies like the UK, Germany or France, but they are really strategically important for natural resources, and that's becoming a key kind of area of what some people refer to as the new Cold War
Okay.
between the US and China. And some people say Africa is a key battleground in that. I mean, we
Mhm.
can talk, if you like, more about that.
Yes.
But to come back to your point about China being better at kind of projecting and exerting power in other parts of the world, I think that's largely true.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is because the Chinese Communist Party is able to control and coordinate the society, state owned corporations, state owned
Mhm.
banks. It has all of these kind of vectors of power that are integrated into a loose kind of ecosystem, which then can be externalized in order to generate both economic and political benefits for
Yeah.
China. And the two often go hand in hand. Sometimes there are contradictions between them. So, China gave out a lot of loans to fund infrastructure around the world. Many of
Right.
those projects haven't worked.
Yeah.
Populations have pushed back, there have been debt defaults. So sometimes there's a contradiction between the economic kind of objectives and the political outcomes. But for a lot of the time, it works. The two kind of work hand in hand.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. So there are a bunch of, I mean, you said a whole lot that I want to go back to that we could
Hmm.
unpack. But the
Hmm.
thing that immediately jumps to mind to respond would be, from my understanding, that China has part of the reason why China has been so successful in recent years, or the last couple
Mm.
of decades, say,
Mm.
at this investment and influential strategy is, I
Hmm.
think, because the US for many, many years has kind of overplayed their hand in aggression
Hmm.
in the loans and in the and also the way that they kind of come to collect the loans, in the sense
Mm.
that they say, hey, we're going to build a military base here, or hey, we're going to
Hmm.
overthrow your, and it's become a lot less subtle over time.
Right.
And I
Okay.
think that, it started off as much more in the shadows, and I think we became a lot more self-confident, and perhaps to a detriment. And
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of people started becoming very resentful of the United States, and that's where China is almost welcome in, because, and again, with the long-term potential of a strategy without elections every 4 years, and you
Hmm.
could really implement a strategy over 20 years without ever worrying, and like you say, you have the corporations and the private sector all lumped
Hmm.
in.
Hmm.
It gives China opportunity to come to anyone that feels that they were slighted or worse by the U.S. and say,
Hmm.
"Hey, I promise we're not going to do that to you. We've always been subtle. We don't build
Hmm.
military bases like that. We don't put, send troops all over the place or kidnap presidents in the middle of the night.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, so why
Yeah.
don't you guys work with us instead?" And then, obviously that comes with their own set of cons, like you mentioned. But I
Hmm.
think that our own America's own self-assuredness kind of shot itself in the foot.
Mm. So, there are different theories about how so-called great powers or empires, if you want to put it in that term, people dispute whether the US is an imperial state or whether it's hegemonic, was hegemonic, but anyway, very powerful big states like the US and China. There's kind of theories about when they become globally dominant, they tend to have to invest militarily in security, in
Mhm.
institutions to try and preserve their kind of global positioning.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea of imperial overreach. So the British, some people claim, did that in the 19th century, where, in Africa, for example, they were interested in colonizing as much of it as they could, irrespective of whether it was an economic proposition for them, but
Right.
for geostrategic reasons, to prevent the French getting it, to project power and prestige, and all of those kinds of reasons. So there's a certain hubris that may build up, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, that we're number one, nobody's going to be able to touch us in
Hmm.
the future. This was the way it was meant to be, in the US. Obviously, there was the Monroe Doctrine, which is now
Hmm.
being revived, that the US would be the only real power in the Western Hemisphere, manifest destiny, that the US would be able to expand across the North American, much of the North American continent, and that was the destiny of the nation to fulfill that. So that kind of expansionist culture philosophy, we can see kind of being resurrected in some of the kind of moves that are being made currently.
Yeah.
But I think what's happening, the U.S. national security strategy was released a few weeks ago,
Okay.
the new Trump one, and it was an interesting document, because basically it talked about the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump corollary. And some people said this was the US trying to carve out a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and assert its kind of dominance or ownership of
Hmm.
that region. Other people, though, and then to leave Asia for the Chinese and Europe for the Russians,
Hmm.
this idea of kind of spheres of influence. But I read it a little bit differently. I think that the Trump administration isn't giving up on American dominance or primacy,
No,
but
no.
what it wants to do is to actually leverage the kind of geographical advantages and resource endowments of South America in order to assert or reassert global US dominance. So I've been reading about, for example, Venezuela
Yes.
contains 17% or 20% of the world's known oil reserves. And so if there is a scenario where China is not able to access Venezuelan oil, the US has now sanctioned Russian
Sure.
oil companies, Rosneft and others. So that means I was reading an article earlier today saying, that 70% potentially of Chinese oil imports would then be controlled by governments that are favorable to the United States. So
Right.
China wouldn't be able to invade Taiwan because the US could constrict its oil supply. So there's a different geostrategy, I think, at play in
Definitely.
this national security strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually, it's so great that you bring that up because I was actually initially opposed to the whole Venezuela involvement, as
Hmm.
you know, and perhaps it was a little nearsighted of me or short-sighted, and I do have that problem sometimes where I'm
Hmm.
the first to admit that I don't have that big picture perspective a lot of times, so
Hmm.
I have a harder time with that. But I thought, listen, if this was about drugs, Mexico is a much bigger problem as far as
Hmm.
US is concerned.
Sure.
Even the northern border by Canada is a much bigger problem.
Okay.
And if we're going to start there, and then it turns and then someone made the argument to me that China and Russia do buy an enormous amount of their oil from Venezuela,
Hmm.
and if you cannot, and if America could accomplish this mission without any lives given, first of all, which is the
Hmm.
priority, and without damaging
American
American.
lives.
What?
I think there were people killed, but
Really?
no, no, no.
In Venezuela?
Yeah, I saw some reporting that there were people killed in Venezuela. There were
Oh,
no American service people killed,
okay.
and obviously no aircraft lost. But I think there were Venezuelans killed. Yeah,
In the
that's
strike
what I've
time.
seen anyway.
I have
Yeah.
a buddy of mine that does business. He does seafood and vegetables import and export
Okay.
into South Florida, and
Yeah.
he goes to Venezuela a lot. And he actually said that something happened, his factory burned down or something like that.
Okay. Okay.
He said it was right around all that whole area, but
Okay.
from my understanding, so minimal, I suppose, relatively minimal
Hmm.
sacrifice as far as a war goes, or as far as a
Hmm.
change in opposition, or a regime change goes.
Hmm.
Um, and it seems, I mean, I hope that that's it. I don't know, but I hope that that's it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the problem also is, and again, America has, I mean, I always like to kind of flip the script and just say, what would we do if we're in someone else's shoes or someone else is doing
Sure.
if someone else was doing this to us, how would we respond?
Sure.
If someone did something that really damaged the potential for us to get access to up to 20% of the world's oil,
Hmm.
I would consider that, I'm sure America would consider that an act of violence in some kind of way, shape, or
Hmm.
form, and that would
Hmm.
encourage some kind of warfare. Whether it might not necessarily mean boots on the ground, but it could
Hmm.
mean some kind of propaganda warfare, or spy warfare, or
Hmm.
political warfare, or
Sure.
soft influence warfare, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm sure that we're kind of inviting that kind of attack from everyone that we're upsetting by shaking this up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a few issues around that, and obviously resources in Africa are central as well, particularly rare earths,
Hmm.
so-called critical minerals. We can talk more about that if you like, but
Please.
um, I think it's a gamble, and the consequences are unknown. And some people have been saying, that even if it seems there's the difference between a kind of tactical action and something which is strategic, even from an American self-interest kind of point of view, something which may seem kind of tactically well executed or well conceived strategically. If it undermines international law, if it undermines soft power, the kinds of things you were talking about, influence more broadly,
And sets
then
precedent too. It sets
exactly.
precedent that we don't want to necessarily be applied,
Yeah.
to us.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, the old adage, violence begets violence. And unfortunately, I think that still holds true. The other question, of course, is about to what extent the Venezuelan government, under the newly installed interim president, will actually do US bidding,
Hmm.
or how will they balance with the demands of political power brokers and power
Sure.
holders in Venezuela. So that's all still up in the air. Again, some people, Adam Tooze apparently had a piece from Columbia University where he said this was imperial cosplay. So basically, rather than having a big ground invasion force like Iraq, you send in this kind of Delta Force, special operators. It's a very quick operation. They're in and out in a couple of hours, and it appears it's been a major achievement or operation. But in actuality, you've let off some bombs, you've kidnapped someone, but in reality, maybe not much has really changed.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess we'll have to see. I guess we'll have to see. I think that it's just a matter of taking our time and letting the situation breathe a little bit, because we all
Mm-hmm.
know that the risks of celebrating a little too early is, especially combined with typical American arrogance, might be might be a dangerous
Okay.
combination. Um, I would love to. So I want to talk to you about a bunch of fun topics that I think are important for people to learn about, or at least to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of these concepts,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that a lot of these concepts exist objectively, and
Mm-hmm.
then fun and sometimes crazy conspiracy theorists get hold of them and kind of twist everything
Mm-hmm.
on its head. And unfortunately, they actually end up ruining the truth that is at the root of a lot of conspiracy theories. Everything,
Mm-hmm.
the best lie has a bunch of truth to it, and you kind of just change, the inconvenient aspects of it for
Mm-hmm.
your bidding.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you teach and study globalization. I took a couple of classes about that in college
Mm-hmm.
when I was back in 2015, 2016, 2017,
Mm-hmm.
and I at the time, and I didn't understand what it was at the time, and I kind of understand a lot more today of
Mm-hmm.
what that looks like. Can you explain what the concept of globalization is and the potential pros and cons of a globalized world as opposed to the world we've been living in until now?
Okay. So, there's different definitions of globalization. At its most basic, it's increased interconnection between places. So,
Hmm.
through trade, investment, flows of ideas, people. So, there's a variety of different vectors. Um, there's different types of globalization. So, we could think of the transatlantic slave trade as a form of globalization, or French colonialism in Africa, or Indochina as a form of globalization. But people have written and talked a lot about neoliberal globalization, the kind of spread
Hmm.
of free markets, free market ideology, privatization across the world, starting from the late 1970s through to, well, probably the global financial crisis really is the high watermark for that. But globalization is, if we're thinking about neoliberal globalization, it was very much focused on kind of profitability and extending this social logic of profitability across the globe
Oh
into
yeah.
healthcare, into water, into basic good, lots of things that could be commodified. We're now seeing that that model of globalization generated these huge inequalities,
Hmm.
that it hollowed out the European and American manufacturing bases, along with automation and other developments, and that has generated this political backlash against that kind of globalism, as it has been called.
Yeah.
And then we're seeing the use of tariffs, more industrial policies,
Hmm.
even the American government taking ownership stakes of companies like Intel, or charging Nvidia to sell microchips to China, getting a slice of that.
Hmm.
So that we've seen this resurgence of what some people refer to as state capitalism, But that
Right.
doesn't mean that globalization is dead. If you look at the statistics, global trade still grew even under Trump's first year in office. Global trade, and part of that is because globalization is what social scientists refer to as a recursive phenomenon. So if I sell you, you're in Florida, I send you a packet of coffee in the mail, and then you send me money, in exchange for that. So one flow has generated the other flow, but I then take that money and maybe I buy something from China with it. And then
Hmm.
the money moves on from there and it sets
Wow.
off all of these other flows. So it has this kind of dynamism or kind of feeding back and amplifying itself as one flow sets off another flow. And then you have kind of negative impacts, positive impacts. You have pushback, blowback, depending on the particular geographic context and the types of flows and the power relations driving those flows. So that's why globalization is a deeply embedded phenomenon in market economy or economies. It's not going away, but people talk about slowbalization. Maybe it's slowing down. So it's an interesting phenomenon to study.
Yeah, it is. And it feels, I mean, I can't imagine that it is slowing down because of how everyone is constantly minding everyone else's business and acting as if everyone else's actions are extensions of their own.
Mm.
And, and for better or for worse, one country or the next. And, when you have all these, and I mean, this, perhaps you can argue, and I don't know what you think of this, that the World War, I mean, starting with World War One,
Yeah.
is kind of the first case of mass globalization in a very negative way, in the sense that everyone kind of got involved in everyone else's business. And a lot of people don't even know why World War One started. You could say it started because of an
Mm.
assassination, but why the entire world got involved, and
Mm.
why, and why it came to an end is equally. It almost feels like there was an explosion of potential in terms of trade and technology, and we
Hmm.
didn't quite know. And that naturally, when you obviously get people involved in that, you get humanity for better or for worse involved in that as well.
Mm.
And you start to apply these human traits that have been very useful in, or very, or manageable in small communities or cities, and
Hmm.
you apply them to
Yeah.
countries at a time, or
Yeah.
hemispheres at a time, and that
Sure.
changes everything.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not a specialist on European history or World War, but obviously people are talking about the potential for global conflict to break out again.
Yeah.
We see that there is a dramatic uptick in conflict currently around the world, from Ukraine to Sudan to many other places.
Sure.
So we're in an era where there are parallels with previous eras, and I think what you were talking about there, about how power becomes in this global political and economic system that we have very, very concentrated in particular countries. So
Hmm.
the US, China, uh, some others are more marginal players, but they're the big ones. And the Europeans have economic power, but maybe not a
Would you
lot of
consider the
political.
Russians a superpower in that way?
I don't think Russia is a superpower. No, I
No?
think it's a superpower in terms on one axis or vector, which is the amount of nuclear weapons it has. Uh,
That
but
makes a strong statement.
but Vladimir Putin used to talk about the Russia being an energy superpower, but oil prices are quite low. Maybe the U.S. intervention, if that was to drive oil prices down further, apparently, below $50 a barrel, that would really uh, have very negative consequences for the Russian economy,
Hmm.
their ability to fund the war, all of those kinds of things. But the Russian economy is about the same size as the Spanish economy or the Australian economy.
Really?
Yeah, so it's a very small. I think is it the depending on how you measure it. So if you
Okay.
measure it in US dollars, I think it's something like the 13th biggest economy in the world. But if you measure it at what economists call purchasing power parity,
Hmm.
which is what rubles will buy you in Russia versus dollars in the US, but what's put the money people have in their pockets when they spend it locally, I think
Hmm.
it's the fourth biggest in the world. But if
Interesting.
you're thinking about the international weight of the economy, Russia is small. And some people have argued that the war in Ukraine is partly an attempt to, and the Russians have kind of talked about this in their own foreign policy statements and doctrine, that they want to make Russia a pole in the new global order. And obviously, getting access to Ukrainian resources, rare earths, and so on, it would be potentially part of that. Now, there's all sorts of political reasons for the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well.
Sure.
But there's also an economic aspect or dimension to it, I think.
Well,
So,
you
yeah,
always follow the money. You always follow
yeah,
the money.
sure. And also people's ability to stay in power,
Hmm. Sure.
and so, yeah, that's important too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. People that have that get power never give it up willingly,
sure.
unfortunately. Yeah, it's a pretty crappy part of the human condition, I suppose. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
please. Were you about to say something?
No, so I think, when you have that power concentration in particular countries, and if governments feel that the maintenance of their power is dependent on competing or even going to war with other
Yeah.
countries, plus you never know what other countries are thinking
Hmm.
necessarily. I mean, one of the functions of diplomacy is to try and convey and to reassure, that countries don't have aggressive intentions or
Yeah.
whatever. But you could see, for example, the Russian and Chinese governments were obviously very surprised at the US intervention in Venezuela. That they didn't have any foreknowledge, even though there was a big military buildup and everybody knew something was coming. This people talk about the security dilemma,
Hmm.
which is basically you never know what another country's government's intentions are fully.
Sure.
And so you have to take a kind of default position that you have to build up your own military and security and intelligence in order to try and deter and mitigate risk
Yeah.
arising from that uncertainty.
And that's a super slippery slope because the difference between counterterrorism and terrorism is just who wins the war at that point.
Hmm.
And the difference between someone being, doing, and also how far are you going to go to potentially protect from a potential attack, and what
Hmm.
lines are you willing to cross to do so? The show,
Hmm.
it was fun for the first bunch of seasons. Homeland did a really good
Oh yeah,
job
I like that.
discuss, breaking that down.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
a great show.
yeah, yeah.
Um, it's on Netflix now in the States, but I watched I loved it, and I thought that there was a lot of it that I couldn't believe was actually put on screen because of how accurate and chilling it was,
Hmm.
and they got away with it somehow. I guess freedom of
Okay.
speech really does exist, just in certain parts of the world, but
Hopefully, yeah.
yeah, I think it's really great. So overall, globalization has some pros and cons, but unfortunately, the kind of way that we've seen globalization, particularly in an economic sense, and we're going to kind of get
Hmm.
to Africa this way, or at
Hmm.
least South and Central America and Africa. The way
Hmm.
that it kind of manifests, from my understanding, is it rarely goes to the people, and the people, So, for example, when America or China will go to Venezuela or Africa or whoever,
Hmm.
or even Ukraine. Yeah, when
Hmm.
America gives Ukraine a loan and gives them money, it's not
Hmm.
going to the pockets of the Ukrainians to manufacture and build. It's going to Lockheed
Hmm.
Martin, or it's going to American companies
Hmm.
that are delivering their products to Ukraine, and then handing the Ukrainians over the bill and saying, okay, now it's time to pay us back. And if not, we'll take your minerals, we'll take your wheat, and we'll take whatever else we want to
Hmm.
take. We'll put in
Hmm.
any kind of leader we want. But the people, the everyday people, end up suffering economically from this enormous debt that they didn't even get any opportunity out of necessarily. Has China changed up that strategy in the sense that they've made it a little bit more enticing for the people
Hmm.
that when where they place loans, because I know America did a poor job with that, and I'm curious if China had learned from America's mistakes, or if that's another path that's going to lead to more frustration from the populace.
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, what some people argue is that if you have a strong government which is able to kind of negotiate globalization, that it can be very beneficial.
Hmm.
So China, was able to attract a lot of American, European investment, make sure that those companies set up joint ventures with Chinese companies,
Hmm.
that there was technology and knowledge transfer to Chinese people, and then they were able to build up their own companies on that basis.
I'm sorry,
So,
quickly
yeah,
to just emphasize your point, because I have this book here, and apparently, according to John Perkins, the annual economic growth rate of nearly 10% for 3 decades and elevated more than 700 million people out of extreme
yeah,
poverty in China.
yeah, which is
700
incredible.
million people. It's twice as
Yeah,
many people that are in the States.
yeah.
And that's
So,
incredible.
yeah. So, some places have benefited from globalization. The Chinese government arguably managed it very skillfully,
Hmm.
to their own ends. But to keep that rate of economic growth going, you're going to need a lot of natural resources. You're also going to need export markets, okay? And what if you think back, to the 19th century or late 18th century when the Europeans were colonizing different parts of the world, what were they looking for? They were looking for natural resources to fuel
Hmm.
their industries. They were looking for their markets to be able to sell overseas, right?
Hmm.
To boost their own economies. So you see these parallels happening that domestically, yes, there's been a massive economic transformation in China, but externally, those kinds of extractive demands are still being placed on weaker, if I can put it in those terms,
Yeah.
parts of the world economically and politically.
Hmm.
And so, some people talk about elite capture strategies, that if you can get to the heads of state, the decision makers in Africa or Latin America, convince them to give you mineral deals or to take on debt or buy,
Hmm.
more Chinese goods through trade agreements and things like that, that opens up those kind of possibilities. So, domestically, it has been largely economically beneficial, but externally, it has generated all sorts of problems, as well as new forms of investment. The there isn't a one-to-one kind of analogy between European colonialism in Africa and Chinese engagement in Africa.
No.
The Chinese have done things like uh, built special economic zones. They have invested more in different types of infrastructures, often benefiting, as you were talking about, Chinese companies, supplying the steel and the cement and
Hmm.
getting interest on loans and all of those kinds of things. But the balance of benefits, tilts very strongly towards China. Um, but there have been beneficiaries as well. People
Hmm.
have gotten jobs. People have been able to set up their own businesses to supply Chinese investors. So it's
Sure.
it's a it's a it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that this is also kind of a really cool potential example of, I think that there are ways to succeed as an establishment in an established country, and there are ways to succeed as a young, nimble,
Hmm.
creative, and a little bit less weighted with your own success.
Hmm.
Countries that would be, for example, relatively weaker, again,
Hmm.
politically or economically compared to
Hmm.
China or America,
Hmm.
that there's a lot of opportunity to build things up now. And you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I mentioned this the other. I was having another conversation recently, and
Hmm.
I was talking about how I show my high school students Steve Jobs's commencement speech at Harvard,
Oh yeah.
and one of the things he talks about is the value of. He says that sometimes when you're too successful, you get weighed down and you get comfortable,
Hmm.
and you miss that young entrepreneurial and excited spirit, that youthful
Hmm.
spirit, and he said the best thing that happened to him was when he got fired from Apple, that he was
Okay.
able to he found it, and that he found Next and Pixar as a consequence, because he
Mm,
realized I was so focused on the mechanics of being Apple and the
hmm
CEO and the man,
hmm
that I forgot what it's like to be, young and excited. And so I think that there hopefully could present a lot of opportunity for, I hope that
mm,
these younger, especially less regulated societies. I mean, regulation obviously is a response to corruption, and then regulation breeds its own corruption. But especially if you're young and you're starting, America's only 250 years old, and we
mm,
feel, and and the way that we go about life is we're the only thing that's ever existed on planet Earth for,
mm,
and nothing started really before we even got here. And
mm,
we know that not to be the case, but we also see that how much potential and how much productivity could come from a
mm,
young and inspired and potentially, upgraded as far as infrastructure, electricity,
mm,
and so on. I don't know what
mm.
else they do,
Yeah.
but electricity at least. What you can do with it, there's a lot of potential.
Mm. Yeah. I suppose America is young in one sense, but it was the established kind of superpower, and it had that position, pretty much. Well, obviously the Soviet Union challenged it, but it didn't challenge it economically the way China does. So you can still hear me. Oh, you've muted your mic, yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so it's looking at itself how to preserve its kind of advantages, and one of the ways to seems to have, well, the Trump administration thinks it can do that, is by trying to seal off itself from the outside world, reduce the inflow of immigrants, put up tariff barriers, retract from international commitments. Whereas that has opened the door for China to adopt
Mhm.
a different approach, which is no, it's not a very welcoming or open country to, I won't say welcoming, but it's not a very open country to immigrants. But in response to the Trump administration levying very substantial tariffs on Africa, the Chinese government announced that all exports from Africa or African countries with which it has diplomatic relations would now enter China duty free. So, a very different approach, trying
Yes.
to gather in allies, take advantage strategically of this attempt to kind of maintain the benefits of globalization by promoting American exports, but seal off things that are perceived to be less desirable. But of
Hmm.
course, if you look at the performance of the American economy over the last number of decades since the financial crisis, it's actually been quite strong. The Economist had a cover story a couple of years ago about, talking about how it was the growth performance in the United States was absolutely exceptional in world terms. And so people look at that and they say, well, if the economy was doing well at a kind of macro level, is this a good strategy? Now, the problem was that with all of the wealth that was being generated in the US, it was highly unevenly distributed. I saw a map a couple of weeks ago showing where 50% of wealth was concentrated, and it's all in, or a huge amount of it is in big cities, New York,
Yep.
San Francisco. And then you have these, what geographers call left behind places, which still have a lot of people in them.
Hmm.
They see their industries closing, living standards
Hmm.
going down, they're in debt, they're living paycheck to paycheck. And so that generates a political backlash,
Yes.
because so the inequality, both socially and in terms of the geography, then created this dynamic where there's this impulse to try and seal yourself off and re-engineer the system to try and, as I say, maximize the benefits and minimize the perceived negatives. But it doesn't seem to be working from an economic perspective.
No.
I saw the US only added 17,000 jobs in the latest payroll report, and if you strip out the healthcare sector, it's actually
Hmm.
strongly negative. And that is a big contrast to what was happening previously.
Yeah,
So again, you have this paradox where people maybe vote for something, but they end up worse off potentially, or many of them,
sure.
than they were initially. But it's
Yeah.
frustration. It's kind of throw up the snow globe and see how things land.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's oh man, you're covering so much great ground in just in a few short sentences, because that's really a huge problem, and and this also emphasizes really strongly how important geography is to be able to outline and understand exactly what the people, especially when you're a populist type, I guess even like you could argue that Trump is definitely ran on a populist agenda. Whether it's actually
Hmm.
being applied or not, it's another conversation,
Hmm.
or how it's going to be applied, because we'll see.
Hmm.
But either way, imagine, and this was another example that was in the book. If you have five people, and it's very easy to say there's probably even three people with half the wealth in America, you know, a Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and a couple other people, right?
Yeah.
And they make 10% annual. They make 10% a year on their investments, say, and the other half of the economy, right? Because they have half the total wealth.
Hmm.
The other half of them gain 3%, or sorry,
Hmm.
lose 3%. Half of them stay about equal, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The economy is still doing well. The economy is
Hmm.
still up because the three to five people that have half the wealth have gained enough wealth that covers more than half of the total amount of money the
Sure.
country even makes. And
Hmm.
so when Trump says, or when Biden has been saying, and it's funny because again, you vote right, you vote left, you get the same policies a lot of time. And at the end of the
Hmm.
day, the way that it ends up manifesting culturally is probably different, but as far as
Hmm.
economics and a lot of
Hmm.
this other stuff, it really ends up being very similar.
Hmm.
And it's and people feel and at certain point when Trump and Biden and everyone say the economy's doing great, the economy's growing every year, and people are like, I went to the store and I buy cottage cheese and milk and I spend 12.95, and I'm like, what are they talking about? I can't keep up with this. And I happen to be fortunate. I am relatively fortunate. I mean, I I have a mortgage, and I own my home, and I have two kids,
Hmm.
and I work extremely hard, and
Hmm.
and I still can't keep up, and so I can't
Yeah.
even imagine. And I had no debt. I had no student debt, thank God. My dad.
Yeah.
I went to a state college. I paid 5 grand a year for tuition,
Hmm.
but I can't imagine what most people are going through, and
Yeah.
and, and it's really devastating. And you're
Hmm.
getting that feel. There's like an impatient feel,
Hmm.
at least in the States, that's very tangible, that says, can you stop at least saying that everything is going well and at least pretend to address the
Hmm.
issues that the people are feeling on a day-to-day
Yeah.
basis?
Yeah. And I suppose one of the other features of globalization is it is subject to these periodic shocks with long
Hmm.
lived consequences. And I
Hmm.
think probably the two most consequential of those recently have been the so-called global financial crisis, but really what the Chinese call it is the North Atlantic financial crisis, because it was the
Right.
US and Europe that, China kept growing and lots of other,
It's not
um,
a problem.
and then the COVID pandemic, which
Hmm.
spread rapidly because we are so interconnected. And people talk about diseases of globalization. So when you have a transmission, one transmission event to a person, however it was transmitted, whether it was a lab leak or whether it was a species
Hmm.
jumping incident in a wet market in Wuhan, a tiny little event like that has these global
Sure.
ramifications in terms of people's lives, inflation, debt levels for countries, massive.
Hmm.
And of course, the big one that is what some people refer to as a kind of grey rhino. So it's slow moving. You can see it, but it's not a black swan. You don't see it, very clearly. It's not coming quick, but it's moving. It's moving slowly, trundling towards us.
Yeah.
Is the climate crisis, and of course also We have artificial intelligence. There's an economist who was a former advisor to, I think it was George Bush Senior, in the White House, Richard Baldwin. He teaches in
Hmm.
Switzerland now, and he
Does
had a
he?
book a couple of years ago, yeah, at the Graduate Institute, I think, in Geneva. He came to give a talk here a few years ago, but he had a book a few years ago called The Globotics Upheaval, and he says in that book, if you thought, you know, the hollowing out of the American and European manufacturing sectors and the political backlash that we are getting from
Oh,
that
yeah.
was bad. Wait until the accountants, wait until the teachers, wait until the middle class professions are gutted by artificial intelligence. What will that do for inequality and the politics associated with that? So it's not a very kind of optimistic necessary, but it's necessary to be realistic to think about, what kinds of regulations then need to be put in place. How can these things be kind of developed in responsible ways and used in responsible ways so that they don't feed into these bigger problems that we all see kind of
Sure.
emerging.
Coming down
Yeah,
the road. Yeah.
yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts, and I want to actually it's been 45 minutes and we haven't even touched Africa yet,
Okay.
which it shows how much I'm enjoying this conversation.
Yeah, great.
But but a last thought perhaps, and and then we'll move over, is that what I'm more concerned about over AI is the combination of AI and robotics.
Hmm.
Where as in you take Elon Musk's Tesla robot and you stick Grok in it, and then you have it doing actual manual labor. And I think that I don't know. I think that in the future, even 50 years from now, and perhaps I'm sure there'll be varying degrees in which this is kind of right and
Hmm.
mostly wrong.
Yeah.
That the difference between, I think, classes and people and society is not going to be based on money, but going to be based on meaning and wellness and like mental wellness. And I think that it's going to, if you really combine AI and robotics to the extent that you can really make everything so cheap and create wealth and create resources that we've never been able to do on a scale that cheap
Hmm.
before,
Hmm.
then the question really is going to become, well, what do you do with your life? And what do you
Hmm.
do if you don't have a job and you don't need a job and you have a house?
Hmm. Hmm.
Are you going to be smoking weed all day? Are you going to be drinking Guinness all day? Are you going to be having 10 kids? Are you going to be doing
Yeah.
creative projects? What are you going to be doing? And I think that what's going to be the difference, I think that we're going to go through definitely. And also, I think that even as far as technology goes, wherever technology is, it also takes people a long time to kind of catch up to what technology is capable of actually achieving. Like
Hmm.
what AI can do at the moment versus
Hmm.
what people are using AI for are
Hmm.
worlds apart,
Hmm.
And I think that it
Hmm.
takes time for people to kind of figure out, oh, I can do that and I could do that and I could do that.
Yeah.
Eventually, they'll get to the point where where it's almost self-explanatory,
Hmm.
and it won't need to catch up. But I think
Hmm.
at that point, the question really is going to be,
Hmm.
I think life is going to become about exploration and meaning. And at
Hmm.
that point, we're going to get somewhere else.
Yeah. It sounds a bit like Karl Marx's vision of communism, Frank.
Yeah,
But
I
but
mean, it's
but
post-capitalism. It's post-capitalism for sure. But we know that this
yeah.
version of this corporatocracy capitalism, where
Hmm.
where corporations, banks, and governments suck out the resources from the people,
Hmm.
is not go. It can't be sustained very long. And it's been going on for, let's say, if you want to say like very, very conservatively, 25 years, but it's been
Hmm.
really going on since World War II almost, it feels like.
Hmm.
Um,
So
yeah,
yeah,
it's
I'll
going to
just
flip
say
on its.
one thing. You're prompting a thought as well, which is apparently one out of every two robots in the world is now deployed in China. And if you look at and they're manufacturing them as well.
Oh yeah.
Um, but um, but if you look then at Chinese exports, they're in the last couple of years, they're actually gaining market share in traditionally labor intensive things like clothing, which used to require a lot of manual labor. Now
Hmm.
it's the robots that are being
Hmm.
purposed and designed to do these things. So China is bucking the trend by not losing a lot its manufacturing industry, but automating, robotizing, using AI, the things you're talking about, in
Hmm.
order to maintain its advantage, even in the lower end, or what were traditionally thought of as lower end kind of economic activities.
And
And
what are
that
those
will,
people in
yeah,
China doing now? What are the people whose jobs they're replacing now? Are they
yeah.
what happened to them?
So the Chinese economy is a kind of dual economy. So if you look, the Chinese government says the economy is growing at around 5%, which is still a fast rate of
Mhm.
economic growth. Other independent groups like the Rhodium Group say it's much closer to 2.5%, 3%. And property prices are falling dramatically, and property accounts for about a third of the Chinese economy.
Wow.
So the macro economy and the macroeconomic picture in China is very poor. There's high debt levels. So people talk about peak China. Have we hit peak China? Has, you know, the idea that China is going to be ruling the world in the next couple of decades, is that misplaced because of these troubles that the Chinese economy is undergoing? But at the same time, there is very dynamic sectors of the Chinese economy: artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
renewable energy.
Hmm.
The Chinese trade surplus hit over $1 trillion last year for the first time. So they're
Wow.
dominating in the industries of the future. But when you have approximately 1.4 billion people, not everybody can be a software engineer or design robots, or whatever. So
Yeah.
it's a very dualistic economy. And youth unemployment was reported a couple of years ago at 21 or 22%. The Chinese government didn't like that statistic, so it cancelled the statistical series which
Beautiful.
produced that result. And
Beautiful.
and then now youth unemployment in China is now apparently about 14%.
Wow,
But
that's incredible.
there's this phenomenon called lying flat in China, which is, the kind of Western stereotype of Chinese college students or educated people is they're incredibly motivated, high achieving, really good at STEM, math subjects,
Hmm.
all that kind of stuff. But this phenomenon of lying flat is basically where young people say, okay, I have a college degree, maybe I even have a master's, but there's no point in looking for a job because I'm just not going to find it. It's better to lie flat and just take it
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah.
So the New York Times had a story a couple of years ago about, I think it was a cigarette factory, and a lot of the people working on the production lines had undergraduate degrees, if not master's degrees. So that gives you a sense that there's something
Yeah, sure.
wrong
Yeah.
in badly wrong in the economy. So,
Well, it's
but
not different than
yeah,
here, fortunately, either. And I don't know.
no,
I don't know whether Europe is experiencing the same kind of issues with America that like we call it education inflation or the degree inflation
yeah,
occurs. I don't know if it's quite the same there as it is here, but
mm,
to do anything, you gotta get a job that requires a master's degree and several $100,000 of debt to start
mm,
paying. You start getting $60,000 a year, $75,000 a year,
yeah,
even 100. But like, how far does that take you in today's world? Really?
yeah. I suppose education is generally more socialized in Europe and
Correct.
cheaper.
Oh,
If you have
gotcha.
so
Yes,
the debt is not as big generally
yes.
as
I
as
heard.
big an
I
issue.
spoke to
Yeah.
someone yesterday that went to that a musician, Dr. Ellenberger, and he said that he was in Austria for a couple of semesters, and he said that the school was free. He goes, they had a fraction of the students attending the music
Mhm,
school as America did, but the
mhm,
people that did attend the school were, he goes, these were the equivalent of really sophisticated and mature musicians at 17, 18 years old. And he goes, so the
mhm.
bar is high, education is free, but the classes and the amount of people attending are smaller.
Mhm, mhm.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
So Africa,
yes.
Africa. We could talk. I want to talk. There's a couple of topics I think I would like to learn more about.
Hmm.
Why don't we? Can we start as far just for I think because it's kind of been a hot topic in the news, Somalia,
Hmm.
and I know that the CIA has been sneaking around there quite a bit. And since they've been sneaking around, the Somalian population in Minnesota, I believe, your alma mater,
Hmm.
and Ohio, have really, and I think Columbus or Cleveland, Ohio, have really spiked. But I don't know anything that's going on over there. And what do they have that we would want as far as geography, minerals, or strategic planning that we'd be
Yeah.
invested in them?
Okay. So the central government in Somalia collapsed. Siad Barre's government collapsed in 1991.
So where's
Um,
Somalia, real quickly?
Somalia is in the Horn of Africa, the so-called Horn of Africa. So it's on the Red Sea on the east coast of Africa, northeast Africa,
Gotcha. Okay.
and so it's very close to the Suez Canal. Apparently, a third of global shipping passes off the coast of Somalia. So it's
Wow.
a key trade route, from Asia to Europe in particular, but also for oil coming out of Iraq and Iran through the
Hmm.
Suez Canal to, South America or wherever, or the US or wherever it might be. Um, so it's very geostrategically important. And the government collapsed in 1991. Somalia fractured into different parts, essentially. So there's a northern part called Somaliland, which has been effectively self governing. It hasn't been internationally recognized as an independent state, but it has been a functioning democracy. There generally has been law and order. The economy has done much better than other parts of Somalia. Then there's another region called Puntland, kind of in central Somalia, which has declared kind of independence, but it's a complex relationship with the central government. There have been a variety of attempts to kind of re-establish central governance. But interestingly, a number of months ago, Taiwan recognized Somaliland as independent.
Hmm.
And
Interesting. Underdog.
Israel just recognized it. So Israel is actually the first internationally recognized country
Wow.
to recognize Somaliland. So people have been asking, why is this? Why? And the Trump administration has toyed with or at least spoken about the possibility of recognizing Somaliland. Okay. And the logic that's put forward is that Somaliland is a functioning polity, that we should support places that function well,
Hmm.
rather than pouring endless, you know, Donald Trump in one of his tweets when he was elected just before he's elected the first time, said all aid to Africa was stolen. So this idea that aid is just being wasted, it's not having any impact, you're just reinforcing kind of bad governments and so on.
We've heard that.
But
We've heard that storyline before too, right?
sure,
Yeah.
and but other people have argued that recognizing Somaliland could be strategic because it does sit on this major trade route.
Hmm.
And if there was to be a conflict with China, being able to project military power, from there and to have what the American military call a choke point, where
Hmm.
you're able to cut off your adversaries' critical supplies of oil or minerals or other things, could be advantageous. So there's a geopolitics to this as well. So Somalia is, there's been a resurgence of ISIS in the last couple of years, mostly so that that obviously was centered in Iraq and Syria initially, Islamic
Okay.
State in Syria and Iraq. That's what ISIS,
Sure.
stands for. But because it was forced out of that region, there's now been a resurgence of ISIS, which is centered in Africa
Wow.
and
And what
Somali.
what do
Yeah,
they post? What do they what's their mission there?
ISIS.
Yeah.
Well, it's again, there's debates in the literature about this. There are different kind of terrorist fundamentalist groups. The argument, or the consensus seems to be in a lot of the literature that it's largely local grievances that drive the insurgencies,
Uh-huh.
disaffection with poverty, disaffection with corruption in governments, feeling voiceless,
Gotcha.
all of those kinds of things. And also sometimes these groups recruit young people who are unemployed, maybe pay them
Mm-hmm.
$100 a month, which is a lot of
Sure.
money. Al Shabaab in Somalia was doing that, paying people about 100, so it's a livelihood. So
Yeah.
there's an economic dimension to it as well. But the there is this kind of global franchise that ISIS has. So you're able to access, even if a lot of what's motivating your recruits locally is local grievances, they're tapped into this global network where they're able to access arms, resources, money,
Sure.
promotional materials, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so the agenda obviously is to overthrow the government, establish Islamic law, Sharia law, as the governing principle of society, kick Westerners and Western influence, and also what are perceived to be the influence of corrupt governments, in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states.
Sure.
Get rid of foreign influence. Have a
Yeah.
kind of supposedly pure society where it's governed by local people without external interference, based on the principles of kind of a fundamentalist reading of the Quran,
Yeah.
where you can't really argue with that. You can't argue with God. If God is on your side,
Then
you're
who's on their
right.
side?
Yeah. So that's what makes fundamentalism very dangerous, irrespective of whether it's free market fundamentalism or
Sure.
Islamic that there's no room for debate,
Yeah.
learning, discussion, understanding
Terrible.
other people's points of view. It's a kind
Is
of
Somalia a Muslim country, or is that part of Northern Africa Muslim primarily?
yes, it
It
is,
is.
and that has some interesting effects, positive
Justice makes
effects.
kind of sense there in that context.
In what way now?
In the sense that, meaning they're not going to a Christian country and trying to preach Muslim values to a Christian country. They have an audience that's already relatively open to hearing what they have to say.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition of religiosity. Obviously, it's close to West Asia or the Middle East, and
Hmm.
there's a whole history there. But also, Islam historically has been an axis of resistance to Western intrusion.
Yeah.
So going back to British colonialism,
Hmm.
General Gordon in Sudan and the Mahdi, this is something you can mobilize people around against foreign interference or
It's a
influence.
great message. It's a great. I don't mean to say the fundamentalist part of it, but the argument that, hey, other people are, that don't have necessarily your best interest in mind, and you're the ones that are fronting the bill every time and having a hard time, and you know what? Aren't you better off just living by yourselves and doing what Somaliland is, and just self-governing and making life better? Like, isn't that like, since I mean, I showed my high school class because I teach high school English, and I showed my class a video of the neo-Nazi recruiting, video. And I said, listen, a lot of these kids are not different than you guys. A lot of these kids don't start off on a very different page than you guys. The
Sure.
the, the leap they make is as like, and like we said earlier, all conspiracies kind of start with a grain of truth. And if there are grievances with someone else minding your business without your invitation, then
Yeah.
it's a legitimate grievance as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
So I was at a talk by a famous Africanist called Christopher Clapham a number of years ago, and he was talking about when he visited Somaliland, and he said the money dealers used to just draw a piece of cloth over their piles of dollars and euros and pounds and whatever else when it was time to go to prayer, and nobody would touch their money. They'd leave it out on the street. So that, so very secure. Now, there has been conflict in Somaliland as well, but some people argued that Islam or particular types of Islam
Mhm.
provide a very strong basis for social connection and cohesion and a strong moral code around community. And that, can be very advantageous.
Hmm.
And also, if you look at HIV rates in Somalia, they're very low.
Hmm.
And that again, there's kind of strict mores around sexuality,
Uh-huh.
and that has reduced transmission rates there, to around 1% maybe, or less,
Wow.
less than 1%, as compared to some countries in Southern Africa, at times over a third of the population was
Hmm.
infected.
Wow.
There's benefits, but obviously it depends on, you know, uh, I'm not an expert on religion, but a lot of people argue that these kind of insurgent movements, they're fundamentally political. They're not really religiously motivated. The religion provides a kind of motivating ideology,
Sure.
but fundamentally it's about material conditions, political grievances, you know.
Hmm.
There was a good documentary about Somalia a few months ago about ISIS in Somalia on Sky News, and Donald Trump ordered drone strikes there against ISIS. Didn't doesn't get reported so much in Western media, but one of the things that struck me in that documentary where there were children's toys kind of burned up, left over from one of these missile strikes. So again,
Going to talk
it
about that, do we?
yeah, so it doesn't it but it doesn't really get reported in the same way
Sure.
as
Sure.
Venezuela, or if something happens in the UK or the US.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure someone
Yeah.
makes a phone call and says this is a matter of national security, and right now we have, we have something in the works, and right now we need you just to keep this quiet for a little bit.
And
And
also getting like Alex Crawford was the Sky reporter who went to kind of investigate it. But again, it's a tough assignment
I can
as
imagine.
to get in and talk to people there. So
I can imagine. I can
yeah.
imagine. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So that provides pretty good context. Is anyone else? Are there other players like China that are involved in Somalia, as far as you know, or is it primarily?
So Turkey has had a big footprint
Ah.
there,
Okay.
and that there's a whole regional geopolitics. The United Arab Emirates and Turkey are essentially supporting different sides in Sudan's civil war.
Hmm.
So they're I was reading about this recently. Some people again say that it is a contest to have influence along that very strategic trade
Yes.
route. And
Right.
of course, there's resources, there's gold, there's other things. There are huge exports of livestock from the Horn of Africa to the Gulf states. So it's kind of a food basket for the
Hmm.
Gulf states. So again, power, money, follow the money, as you were saying. So that contest is ongoing. Somalia, for the most part, has been so
Okay. Sorry about that.
yeah. So as you were saying, follow the money. Where can money be made? Power projection. These things go
Yes.
together. Somalia um, has, I think, fossil fuel deposits off the coast.
Hmm.
Fisheries, uh, Somali fisheries have been plundered for decades. Once the apparently the original kind of Somali pirates were ex-members of the Somali Navy who saw foreign fishing fleets come into their waters
Oh
and kind
man.
of just extract the fish,
Yeah.
uh, dump toxic waste. Western and other, companies dumping toxic waste there. Because it was a kind of ungoverned space, because it didn't have a central government for a long time that could have kind of enforce
Hmm.
security and rule of law. But but getting large scale foreign investment in Somalia has been very difficult because it has been so insecure. I did see that the tourism ministry was looking to promote tourism to the country. The security situation did improve quite substantially there for a time, but the Ethiopians have also been very interested in Somaliland in particular as an alternative route to the sea. So
And where's
Ethiopia,
Ethiopia relative to Somalia?
it's next door.
Okay. Gotcha.
So the Ethiopian government actually invaded Somalia in the 2000s to depose a government that came to power called the Islamic Courts Union, which re-established order in the country, but it was a repressive government. But
Sure.
the Ethiopians invaded, and the country kind of plunged back into chaos. So there are debates about, and actually the head of that Islamic Courts Union actually ended up becoming the president again with kind of Western support. So there was a lot of um, kind of in Ireland we talk about kind of slips between the cup and the lip. You know, there was a lot of politics and a lot of machinations and all sorts of different actors involved. But it's generally been too insecure to really attract a lot of big investment from overseas. But you know, that may change in the future. But Somaliland has been relatively stable, and
Sure.
there was a deal that was meant to be inked with Ethiopia around leasing a port to the Ethiopians, so they'd have an alternate route to the sea from Djibouti that they currently rely on.
Hmm.
Again, there was a lot of controversy about that. Was this de facto recognizing Somaliland as an independent state? You know, the African Union doesn't recognize it, but Israel recognizes it. So who says, you know, again, these external powers and players should be able to make decisions, you know, which affect
Yeah.
Africa when the continental institutions don't recognize Somaliland as independent, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's just a matter of how many big brothers say you're for real until everyone says, okay, fine, you're for real, whatever, and it could be for the better. I don't know. I don't know what's
Mm.
gonna. I guess we'll have to see in the coming years and pay attention as it plays out a little bit.
Mm.
I wanted to also talk about BRIC because I saw you would write about that, and then I had to look it
Yeah.
up, and then once I did, I was like, oh, I definitely want to dive into that a little bit. So if you wouldn't
Okay.
mind.
Sure. So the BRICS is a grouping of mostly what are called global South countries. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa joined in 2010.
So BRICS now.
So BRICS, and then Indonesia and Ethiopia and Egypt and other countries have joined. There's also partner countries, so it's been expanding in the last couple of years
Wow.
pretty substantially. And the UAE is a member. Saudi Arabia was meant to join, as was Argentina, but Javier Milei decided not to join because he's pro-US rather than pro-China, let's say. And again, the Saudis maybe thought better of joining a grouping that was certainly
Yeah.
perceived by the Trump administration to be anti-American in orientation. But
Sure.
I think BRICS really came about after the global financial crisis because it was sensed that the West was kind of in decline, its influence was in decline. There was an opportunity for countries from the global South to kind of come together and have a collective voice in a way that they hadn't really for decades. And China's economy was still growing rapidly. India's economy is currently growing, very rapidly, and they have a shared interest in reforming the global system so that it's less Western centered and dominated and more reflective of the interests of, well, they say the majority world, the developing world or global south where most of the world's population live.
And what would that look like? Would that look less capitalistic? Would that look more communist? What's the
Yeah.
vision
So,
for that?
so part of the issue is that the different countries in the grouping are very, very different. So there's no
Yeah,
one
that's
model.
noticed.
Yeah. So, India has popular elections, China doesn't. They compete with each other. They have border clashes. They have different security interests. So they cooperate on some things and they compete on others. So there's no real one model, but the way I read it, the apparently one large city in China's economic output is the same size as the entire economy of South Africa. So you kind of see who the big dog is in BRICS.
Hmm.
It's China. And China, economically, politically, it has a permanent seat, like Russia, on the UN Security Council. It has all these power resources.
Hmm.
And this is a way of trying to gather in other countries to support China as it has risen in
Yeah,
importance economically and politically.
I see.
So, but other countries have, and people in those countries have their own visions and interests. But the idea that globalization has been too Western dominated, that the institutions of global governance, the United Nations, headquartered in New York, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund,
Hmm.
headquartered in Washington, D.C.,
Oh
these
yeah.
have been too Western dominated. And there's a need both to reform those institutions and to develop new institutions. So, kind of twin track strategy, develop new institutions which will better serve the interests of the participant countries. And then there are concrete initiatives. I don't know if you saw a few months ago, Donald Trump said that if the BRICS tried to move away from using the dollar for trade, he would impose massive tariffs on them if they tried to do that. But there is an interest in de dollarization. So, because the US dollar is effectively the world's reserve currency, that gives an immense amount of power to the United States because if you transact your oil purchases in dollars or anything else,
Hmm.
you have to have a bank in the US, a correspondent bank, who is going to kind of oversee that transaction because it's in US dollars. And that means the US can sanction banks, companies around the world and stop them using US dollars, cut them off from the US banking system. They even sanction individuals like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, for I'm trying to remember what her exact title is, but it's Palestine, I think.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they
yeah.
they
And
sanction. So
what do they
she
do?
can.
They sanction as in she couldn't get access to American dollars?
No, she can't have a bank account. Because if her Italian bank, I think she's Italian, if her
Yeah.
Italian bank allowed her to have a bank account, then they wouldn't be able to engage in any dollar transactions or have a correspondent bank
Wow.
in the United States. They've sanctioned international criminal court judges. So you can sanction. So there's a book called Underground Empire which talks about this. So there's about 3,000. I was at a talk about it during the summer in the US. There's over 3,000 prescribed entities, they call them now, um, where the US has sanctioned companies or individuals or networks or whatever. And so this gives the US this massive leverage. And some people have argued that because Venezuela was beginning to sell oil in the Chinese currency, this was one
Mhm.
of the motivations
I hear.
for the decapitation operation in Venezuela. That
That's a big threat.
to preserve the primacy of the US dollar in
Yeah.
international trade and finance, Saddam Hussein started selling oil in euros. Uh,
Uh-oh.
Muammar,
Yeah.
Muammar Gaddafi had a plan to have a gold dinar currency that oil would be sold in. And again, we know what happened to him.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, so there's, the other thing that the fact that there's such demand for American dollars does in the world in order to facilitate trade um, and investment is that it means the US can print money and buy stuff effectively for free from other countries without having to work for it.
Well,
You
it's
just
not
print
free.
it.
We just pay later.
There's downs. You're right. There's all sorts of downsides to this,
Yeah.
but you can print dollars and buy things from Japan or buy things from Ireland. But obviously, there's all sorts of problems with it in
Sure.
terms of trade deficits. It gives rise to other dysfunctions as well.
Yeah, yeah. I did a great episode with a gentleman named he's a professor Lawrence Levy. Lawrence, no, White. Lawrence White, I'm sorry. And
Okay,
he
I know of him. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and he was
Yeah.
wonderful, and he and I talked because I didn't understand anything about the gold standard or when we got off it or what the point of it was, and so he and I
Mm.
talked through a lot of this stuff for like an hour and a half, and that
Okay.
was really really wonderful.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean that was, and you're just gonna get the same. I mean, the thing is, you can make the same points, but they don't, to two different people, but they won't see it the same way,
Sure.
and that's just what it is,
Yeah.
And so whether it's a good idea or not, I think that people
Yeah.
could always convince themselves one way. And by the way, you always can. I mean, there's always studies for everything you wanna say, and there's always something to back up everything you wanna point out. But whether or not it's a good idea, I think that has been. I think that free will and that willingness to just spend and print money has arguably is the source is a big part of the reason why the economy in America is the way it is today.
Yeah.
And and I give this example that the America, the homeland, the taxpayers are the life source of this empire, and it's the heartbeat of the arms and the fingers and the limbs that are spreading out around the world. But you got to make sure that your heart's healthy. And I mean, Americans of all people should understand the dangers of heart condition. And so, I think that if you want to say that this was an experiment that you could try for a little while, for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, great. But like, how much longer are we gonna try to do that for?
So I've been reading a little bit about this as well, that the Trump administration is very keen on stable coins and
Hmm.
cryptocurrency. And so, is this a kind of vector of competition of the future, which doesn't have maybe some of the disadvantages of dollar primacy?
Right.
And the Chinese already have the digital yuan. So, will this be a way of competing with China in that space as well?
Yeah, and then the potential downstream consequences is that social currency that we're all afraid of, that I think we saw a little bit of. I mean, if that individual in Italy got debanked for saying something like "Free Palestine" or something like that, I mean, what's stopped that from happening on a mass level throughout the states, one way or the other? And I always like to make this argument. I think that when you're in power, you really lose sight and vision as to what real values are, and you kind of want to maintain that power. And but you're opening the door for people to do the exact same thing to you. That as soon as the pendulum swings back, and the pendulum always swings back, and it's so funny because I just turned 30 recently, and I'm having a little bit of a heart attack about it,
Oh,
and
don't worry. I'm 57.
And one thing that I was thinking about was the fact that I'm thinking these things that I would have absolutely ignored or blown off 10 years ago, and that's how I know that I'm an adult. When I'm giving
Mm,
my siblings or my students advice, that and I know as I'm saying it, if I were them, I would not hear a word of this. But like
sure.
that's what it means to be young. That's what the human condition is this
Mhm.
this endless cycle of just learning and trying and self-correction and mistakes and back and forth. But
Be very
hopefully,
boring otherwise, wouldn't it?
yeah, yeah. But hopefully that's the point of these conversations. And I mean, as a young parent, and I understand my parents more now. You want to teach your kid to avoid the mistakes before they have to actually experience and pay the repercussions themselves. And there's different
Mm,
degrees to which that I think is healthy or not healthy. But
mhm.
I think there's a lot of things in life that we could just cut out, that we don't have to experience all that unnecessary pain if we just listen to history. We just listen to these kind of conversations we're going back
Mm,
and forth.
mm. Yeah, I suppose it'd be nice if we could do that, but we don't seem to
It
be very
would be.
good at it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you watched this new Apple TV show, Pluribus?
I haven't.
Do you know the premise of it? It's really
I
fascinating.
don't know.
The premise is that there's a virus that escapes a lab,
Mm,
and it's not a bad virus. It's a virus that everyone that is infected by it shares one conscious mind, one consciousness,
yeah.
and there's only 10 people in the world that are immune to this
Okay.
virus, and everyone is completely benevolent. They're all kind, because a lot of the
Mm,
things that make the worst of human traits come from
mm,
individuality. They come from the need for the best partner or the most money or the most security or whatever it is. But
mm,
if you don't have that concern, then everyone's
mm,
just good. And so the show really wrestles with the question of what's it mean to be a human? Is it about individuality? Is it collective? Is it, what's it really
mm,
mean to be happy or not? And I'm
mm.
only a couple episodes in, but it's really,
Okay,
really,
sounds good. I'll check it
it's
out.
really
Yeah,
thought, yeah, provoking. Um, we're just about up on time. I had really such a blast. This was
great.
so
Yeah, I
educational. I
enjoyed
learned
it.
so much. I would love to do this again at some point in the coming year, because
Sure.
I think that there's a lot that, especially as news is unfolding, that we could
Mhm.
take to kind of going back and forth and talking about the context of what's going on. But thank you so much for the time. Thank you for
Well,
getting
thank
back to
you.
me when I reached out. And I'm really, this is so much fun.
Great. Great
Uh,
to talk to you, and I hope 2026 is good for you and your family.
same to you. Well, I hope to be in touch. All the best. Thank you
Okay.
so
Bye,
much.
Efra.